Hey my friends, how are you? It is so good to be with you. Let me begin by introducing myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Joe Kay, and I have the great privilege and joy of serving as pastor of Nexus Church of the UCC in Hamilton, Ohio. And I want to thank whoever came up with the idea and the invitation for us to share our thoughts about generosity and stewardship. Two very important things, right? And I know stewardship in particular is kind of a mushy subject. For one thing, it's a word we don't hear very often. It used to be a common word, but not anymore. Now when you hear stewardship, it's usually within the context of church. And if you're a layperson and you hear stewardship from the pulpit, you immediately say, oh, they're going to hit me up for more money. And we've tried to expand this out to add time and talent to treasure. But the truth is we mostly track the money, the numbers. And when it comes to asking people to invest their time and talent, we're usually inviting them to do it in ways that are kind of limited and predetermined and preset. You can contribute this in this way in these times. And often a lot of people today, especially young people, get left out of that equation. I want to talk today about stewardship, not from the pew standpoint, but from the standpoint of us in leadership. A little different take on this. Because stewardship is very important to us. And often good stewardship begins with those who are leading, recognizing the gifts that people have to give and creating ways for them to give gifts, especially when they're gifts that on the surface don't seem to be what we need or as much as we need. And I want to start by sharing my favorite stewardship story. It involves a basket like this one. It's a story told 6 times in the Gospels combined, which is unique. All 4 of the Gospels have a version of it, which is also highly unusual. So the story is saying, I'm trying to get your attention. This is important. Pay attention. And you know the story. Jesus is preaching for a long time. He gets done. The people are hungry. In some tellings of the story, the apostles say, hey, these people are hungry. How are we going to feed them? In other tellings, it's Jesus who says we need to feed these hungry people. But in any case, the story goes to this point where they have a basket with 7 things. Sometimes it's 7 loaves. Sometimes it's 5 loaves and 2 fish. But it adds up to 7. And we all know that in the Jewish tradition, 7 is a very deeply symbolic number. It says completeness or fullness right in this basket, regardless of how it may look on the surface. And the apostles are like, we got nothing. And Jesus says, no, start sharing it and see what happens. God has this weird math. And they do, and there's more than enough, and there is 7 or 12 baskets left over, depending on which version of the story is being told. What was in the basket was exactly what they needed, fully what they needed, and when you multiply it and share it, it winds up being more than enough. And my favorite telling is in the Gospel of John. He adds this one wonderful little detail where it's a boy, or a lad as he's referred to in some translations, who has the basket. And we all know that children back then were seen as having nothing to give. They were a mouth to be fed. Keep the children away from Jesus. You stay away from the kids. They really have nothing to contribute to us or our society or our religion. They really can't be working with the Spirit to bring us what we need. And it is this child that is the one that has everything that they need. The child ends up being the one that feeds everyone by his courage to share what he has. And he has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And again, the apostles say, look, it's a boy and this is all he's got. We don't got enough. Turns out to be more than enough. And the truth is that we all do this, right? I mean, we all have preconceived notions of what we need as faith communities, what we need as denominations, what we need as people of faith. And when we see what we think we need, we go, we need more of this. But very often what we think we need is not in the basket right in front of our faces. Something else is in different amounts. And we just kind of turn up our noses or even just walk away from it. Our preconceived notions lead us to throw up our hands and say, we got nothing. Which brings us to our second story about stewardship in the Gospel of Mark. And you know this one too. The apostles, or the disciples, it says, are there, and a man brings his son who is inhabited by a demon, asks them to drive the demon out. They can't do it. So then he goes to Jesus, says, your disciples couldn't do it, can you? Jesus does. Then he explains to the disciples how to do it. And what's weird is that instead of the disciples then going, okay, how can we do this better? How can we have the Spirit in us more? They start arguing over who is most important. They do this a lot, arguing over who's most important. They think disciple or apostle is this title of honor, sort of like reverend or doctor or pope or bishop or archbishop or pastor or rector, whatever. And that's what makes them important, and they've got to be important and act important. And Jesus corrects them yet again and says, the one who is least but serves is the most important. You don't get it. And right after that, John jumps in and says, hey, Jesus, by the way, I meant to tell you, we saw this person who was not of our company, not one of us, who was driving out spirits in your name. So we tried to stop him. You can almost see Jesus do yet another palm plant on his forehead going, you don't get it. The Spirit wants us to heal. The Spirit wants to live through us and to make the world a more whole place. Why would you object to someone doing God's work? Just because they're not one of your company. If they're not against you, they are for you. And it's fascinating. Why would they do this? Again, we can identify, right? For one thing, right before that in the earlier passage, they didn't know, they didn't have the Spirit enough to drive out a demon. And now here's someone else who's doing it. Makes them look bad, hurts their egos. Besides, he's not important like they are. You know, they have this academic training, so to speak. They've followed Jesus around, they've heard all of his words, they've seen what he's done. This other person hasn't done that. They're not of our company. They shouldn't be doing this. They can't be allowed to do this. And besides, we made these sacrifices. We left our boats. We left our families. This person hasn't made these same sacrifices. They shouldn't be allowed to do our work. What they don't realize is that it's not their work, it's God's work. It's the Spirit's work. And anyone who has the Spirit can do this work. You know, it's interesting, whenever you get any sort of church gathering these days, talk pretty quickly turns to leadership and how we don't have enough leaders. We don't have enough pastors. We don't have enough people in seminary. There's no cavalry riding in from the seminary to save us. We don't have interims. We don't have this. We don't have that. And we don't see what we really do have. We have people who have spent their lives doing Spirit-filled work. People who have been counselors and teachers, and they've done training and mentoring and healing. They've written books. They have been leaders in settling crises. They have a very deep spirituality, just like that person who wasn't of their company. They're doing God's work, but we don't see it, or we put up barriers to it. We say that if someone doesn't have seminary training in their basket, then it's not what we need. If someone doesn't have this or that in their basket, then they're not of our company, and so we shouldn't really take seriously what they have to give, or we should see it as less somehow. I think it is incumbent upon us in leadership to take a really hard look at how we're doing stewardship of the many gifts that God is given and is continuing to give to each and every one of our faith communities and to all of us in leadership. Honestly, I don't know why every church doesn't have at least one licensed minister, someone who can fill in and give more pastoral work on a weekly basis, use their many wonderful gifts, what's in their basket, and multiply it out into their congregations. Fill in for the pastor when they're sick, when they're on vacation, or as an interim status to provide spiritual leadership. Give us what we say we really want and what we really need. And then other people in the congregation see them and they're encouraged to do the same as well, to share their time and their talents in the same ways. Because the truth of the matter is, we have enough leadership right now, more than enough. It just might be in a different form than what we think we need. we're more like the apostles than we would like to admit. The apostles who looked at this boy who was very spirit-filled. Think of that, this child who had the great courage to share everything he had, all he had to eat, with these strangers. This child was filled with the Spirit more so than the disciples were. And think also of that one who was not of their company, who was filled with the Spirit more so than the disciples who couldn't do what this other person was doing in the way they were doing it. The pre-Pentecost apostles who run away and deny and abandon. But now, on Pentecost, the Spirit has come upon them, and now they have a fullness of that Spirit, and they go out, and they begin doing all those things in a much deeper and Spirit-filled way. And they begin building these communities, and these communities grow and they spread. And Acts tells us that at a certain point they go, wait, there's not enough of us in leadership, not enough apostles. What are we going to do? They say, we're going to raise up leadership from within our communities. Choose 7 people. There's that number again, 7, right? We can't get away from it. Fullness, completeness, 7 people who will come up and help to lead. And they do. And what's interesting is the criteria they set. The criteria is simply this, that they be faith-filled, Spirit-filled, and also that they have some sort of wisdom. Might seem that that bar is pretty low, right? But it's actually rather high. As I said, it was a bar the disciples and apostles themselves didn't meet much of the time while Jesus was around, but now they see it differently. And of course, we all know Stephen becomes the first martyr, and in Acts, there are more words attributed to Stephen than there are to most of the apostles in the other Gospels. This person who might have been overlooked by the pre-Pentecost disciples now is seen for who he is and what he can give, and is invited to give. And I would suggest that's the lesson for us today, to become more like the post-Pentecost disciples than the pre-Pentecost ones. If we're not open to God's unusual math, then no stewardship campaign is really going to work. If we're not doing good stewardship in here, then we're not going to get very far at all. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen and for the invitation to share. And I just want to challenge and invite each of us this coming week and these coming weeks, when we're standing in church and looking out at those faces in our pews, to see people who have so much to share in their own ways, in their own unique gifts and talents, and to see that each one has their own basket. And what's in that basket might kind of throw us for a loop, and we might think it's not enough, but remember, their baskets have everything that we need, more than enough than what we need. Take care, my friends. It's been good to be with you.